being loaded to the aircraft. In a general perspective, in an ASEAN perspective, I think Malaysia is well placed to become a regional hub for ASEAN. In general, in ASEAN, I would say that implementation of all the blueprints and the different roadmaps is key. There must be stronger enforcement on the implementation and to do away with the ASEAN-X formula. To improve the connectivity in the logistics sector is one of the quick wins and, in my view, the only way to enhance ASEAN economic connectivity and integration. Thank you.
So some excellent hands on for his capacity. Also in the past, Fermin actually worked for the World Bank and also McKinsey, so I think he's well versed to be able to speak on the subject matter of actually looking at the services industry here in Malaysia.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for the kind introduction and for the invitation to participate here, and distinguished colleagues here in the panel, guests, and ladies and gentlemen. I also want to touch on some challenges that we see ahead, and some of these challenges have been mentioned by my colleagues and by Pascal. And lastly, I would like to share with you some guidance or some suggestions on how to go forward. So let me first start to share with you some facts and figures that we see in our industry and how Malaysia compares to some of our neighboring countries. And as you know, in technology services, one of the main costs that we have, one of the main inputs that we have is basically people. So one of the main costs to consider is wage. So when we invest or we look at locations, we obviously look at availability of people, differential wages, inflation, attrition. And here we think Malaysia is very, very well placed. If you look at some of the scorecards, indices that have been produced by institutes like IMD, World Economic Forum, etc., you can see Malaysia normally within the ASEAN countries only lags Singapore. Malaysia has been consistently ranked in the top 5 locations within Asia, and in ASEAN only lags Singapore. So that's good news. It's a good base. However, let me share with you some trends that we need to watch. In terms of wages and cost competitiveness, Malaysia is a middle-income country, as all of you know. If we compare the wages in our industry or wage differentials with countries, well-established countries with large pools of qualified workers like India or recently Philippines and other neighboring countries, the differential is not that big with us, with Malaysia. And that's essentially because high-value workers, because of the differential in inflation rates, the gap is not that big. So when we look at on average, the differential cost of wages here versus places like India or the Philippines is between 10 to 20% on average. That's not a big gap. But if you include some of the new larger economies like Vietnam, Thailand, or even Indonesia, the gap is much larger. It's not 10 to 20%. So that's a trend we need to watch. The other very important factor we look at, where we are also in I would say in a good position, in the middle, but in a good position, is attrition. Normally what we do, companies like Logica, what we do, we transfer knowledge. So we invest basically in knowledge transfer, normally in our case from Europe. That process sometimes takes 6 months, a year. So for us, attrition can be a problem, a serious problem, because normally we locate here applications that are mission critical, we service 24/7, like DHL, and we cannot afford high attrition levels because that's costly, and also that causes problems with our services and with our clients. In terms of attrition, Malaysia is also in the middle, lags Singapore, lags some other countries, but is below some of the larger players in the IT industry. Now, another very important thing I think we are privileged here is more of a qualitative factor. I think is because of the cultural heritage industry that we have here, it's much easier to conduct business and to export services from Malaysia to places like Europe than other neighboring countries. Doesn't mean that it will stay like this, but because of the language and because of the cultural fit, for us, we find it easy, facilitates for us to trade and to export services, in particular to our European clients. So in a nutshell, we see Malaysia as a good balance. It's in the middle ground, but as you guys know, being in the middle is dangerous because you will have competition from places like our neighboring country, Singapore, that is also aggressively attracting new centers, and although they have a wage differential versus Malaysia, they have a high productivity, and there's a lot of also incentives, as Mr. Phang was talking, to attract also IT companies. And then from the bottom, we see emerging countries, and I'm not talking about India or the Philippines, I'm talking countries like Vietnam, Thailand, Indonesia, with very, very high wage differentials that are catching up. In this sense, I would like to share with you a couple of challenges as we see it. The first one is how to deal with this competitive, if you will, competitive situation or landscape here in ASEAN. I personally think that Malaysia has to play the card of quality. We cannot stay in the middle because it's unsustainable. Because sooner rather than later, some countries are going to catch with us, and we need to play the card of high value-added services, playing on quality, and maybe picking our fights. We're not as large, we don't have a large pool of workers as some of these countries potentially. I mean, my understanding is that in Malaysia we have 300,000, 400,000 workers in IT and technology services. If you compare that to some of these other countries, is a very, very small percentage of what potentially these other countries can produce in terms of high value-added workers. The other challenge that we see is that we are seeing an alarming trend in terms of a mismatch of the demand for high-quality, qualified skills versus the supply. This is a recent trend. I see it in my company. I see it with some of my colleagues and competitors, even from some of my colleagues in the panel who have also confirmed this trend. We sometimes don't have enough supply of talented, skilled professionals. And this starts at the university level for graduates and also for experienced people. I don't think the trend today is very alarming, but I have seen some of the figures published, and also based on our own experience, we see clearly that there is more demand than supply today in the market for different seniority levels. What to do about it? It's not an easy problem to solve. I mean, it's good that there's demand. I applaud, for example, different initiatives like the Taming Corporation that is bringing back qualified Malaysians in this sector, in other sectors. I think that, again, touching what Mr. Phang mentioned, I think we need more incentives for the services sector. I know because sometimes I have contacts and we have operations in other parts of Southeast Asia, and I know that other countries are aggressively and proactively launching incentives to attract professional services entities or IT services companies. So I think we need a more structured way of providing incentives, whether they're fiscal, whether they're training incentives. And I think lastly, on another note on the supply of qualified labor, I think we can do more to attract top universities to Malaysia. And I know that there's some initiatives in other sectors, in the medical field, but I don't see enough activity, like, again, we've seen in other countries, to attract top European universities, maybe top American universities, to have either campuses or more collaboration, because I think that will improve the supply of the skilled labor, the standards that we have today for graduates in the Malaysian technology market. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed. Okay, now I get the easy job of asking the difficult questions, and the panel now have to answer those difficult questions. So if you let me just start off with a fairly easy one. With the establishment of the ASEAN Economic Community in 2015, what do you think this will mean for Malaysia? We've heard already from Fermin that clearly the human capital issue is a potential concern. We've heard that what he said was that Vietnam and Indonesia is actually catching up. We've also heard from Asa in terms of the logistics and how important connectivity is and so on in this regard. So, does the ASEAN Economic Community offer a real opportunity for Malaysia, or could it in fact be a threat? So I'd hand over the floor first of all to Fermin, please.
I think it's clearly an opportunity. Again, I think we have certain sectors where Malaysia is already involved. If I take, for example, a sector like oil and gas, I think in Malaysia, in ASEAN, we have probably the largest pool of qualified oil and gas professionals, and whether they work in technology or services or other type of services, we can certainly export or do more business within ASEAN in the oil and gas sector, because that's an area where Malaysia already has a history. We have investments. We have a lot of also foreign companies transferring technology, and obviously Petronas has a lot of know-how that has developed over the years. So I definitely think it's an opportunity in certain sectors. My suggestion is that we pick those sectors and we don't try to do everything, but whatever we do it better than the other ones.
So the idea, Fermin, then is to actually create focus and actually focus on what Malaysia is actually good at and where we've got competitive advantage, rather than try to be all things to all men. Okay, thank you. Asa, what would you comment in this regard? I mean, in regard to connectivity and how Malaysia stands as a gateway to ASEAN and so on.
I think that also transpired in my introductory remarks. I think it's definitely a huge opportunity for Malaysia. I think Malaysia is already very well placed in ASEAN and globally, in fact. For instance, DHL, we have placed one of our 2 global IT centers here in Malaysia, and one of the reasons, or a couple of the reasons, were we got a lot of facilitation and incentives from the government, but also the ease of employing foreign workers. If you have a global IT center, you need to employ foreign workers, obviously, because they need to speak the local languages, whether it's in Africa or South America or Japan or Korea. I think also in terms of, let's say, the overall policy environment, with the ETP, there's a very strong commitment from the government side to look at, say, the weak links of the policy and the legal framework and to address them. So there's really a serious dialogue with the business, and we feel that the government here is really listening to whatever concerns that the business or foreign investors have. And that, I think, is quite unique, actually, also in a regional perspective. If you look at foreign rules for foreign direct investment or ownership rules, through the ETP, Malaysia is a very attractive investment destination, also in the particularly, I would say, in the services sector. If now this announced liberalization is followed through and implemented, I have also regional roles or ASEAN roles, so I can clearly see this, that Malaysia has a competitive advantage in this respect. Some of the things, I mean, there are always things that can be improved, and that's facilitation of let's say, for investors to establish themselves. If you look into the rankings, one of the issues is administrative requirements and obtaining different licenses and approval and so on. I cannot say, I mean, from a company perspective that we have any issues with this, but if you look at, let's say, from a general perspective. In terms of hard infrastructure as well, I think Malaysia fares very well, whether it's ports and port efficiency, airports and infrastructure. And the government is proactive in addressing those issues where they see that there are shortages or there are improvements to be made.
Yes, thank you very much indeed.